We saw Julian for the first time in 6 months as a result of the COVID shutdown. He hasn't had any social or legal visits since the pandemic broke out, which has left him incredibly isolated in prison. And it was surprising to us to see that he has lost a lot of weight. And we, of course, have continuing concerns about his health, given the long-term impacts of being both inside the embassy and now in a high-security prison in these circumstances. Of course, you mentioned in your opening that we've now have had not one but two superseding indictments. He was arrested on a second superseding indictment on Monday that the Department of Justice issued in June. We were first told that it made no substantive difference, and we're now told that those new allegations, which include allegations related to Edward Snowden and providing assistance to the NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, now are part of the case and could form part of separate criminal allegations if he is returned to the United States. This is part of what we say the US government is trying to shift the goalposts, as it were. We heard from our defence counsel in court on Monday that, of course, this perhaps in response to the strength of our case, that the US government is now shifting and changing its case almost 18 months after this started and after the closing and submission of evidence from both parties. It is a very unusual and highly irregular process in any kind of extradition case, and certainly one as unprecedented as this. I think adding these additional, quote, hacking allegations, which are general and questionable and of course are denied by Mr. Assange, I think is the Department of Justice attempt to try and shift the case away from the Manning disclosures and of course the evidence that we've heard this week and seen in the publications around the world, evidence of war crimes, human rights abuse, corruption the world over. It is a clear press freedom case, and the attempts by the Department of Justice to somehow create this as a hacking case when there is absolutely no evidence of any hacking by Mr. Assange, I think demonstrates their desire to move away from the important issues on press freedom. We've heard already in the evidence this case, in the evidence this week from Clive Stafford Smith, the founder of Reprieve, about the importance of WikiLeaks disclosures about US extraordinary rendition, torture, and importantly drone strikes and extrajudicial killings in Pakistan, and how those disclosures have been essential in his work, both in terms of holding the US government accountable for those actions in Pakistan, but also with respect to his Guantanamo litigation in the United States. We've also heard evidence from Professor Mark Feldstein about the unprecedented nature of the attack on First Amendment that this case represents, and the history of the Espionage Act being threatened against journalists by various presidents, including Roosevelt and Nixon, and now, in this case, by President Trump himself. Well, Professor Feldstein explained at some length the importance of the First Amendment and how it protects every American citizen and any person within US jurisdiction, their ability to, their free speech. And of course it protects the media's ability to communicate with sources, receive information and publish it in the public interest. What he pointed out about the danger of this particular case is the breakdown of the distinction between sources and journalists. So we've often seen that sources who make unlawful or unauthorized disclosures are prosecuted and can face criminal prosecution as a result of their disclosures. But historically that has never been directed at the media. The First Amendment is understood to protect the media in receiving and publishing that information in the public interest, which is exactly what WikiLeaks did. And in this case, what the Trump administration is alleging is that Julian Assange, by virtue of having communications with Chelsea Manning, receiving information from Chelsea Manning and publishing that information, is somehow conspiring and is conspiring in the underlying criminal act. And we've seen this same prosecution strategy now rolled out in Brazil by President Bolsonaro against Glenn Greenwald. That's why this is so dangerous, because this is the kind of activity that journalists engage in all day, every day across the United States and elsewhere around the world, which is why the New York Times and the Washington Post have both, in their editorials, said that this is criminalizing public interest journalism and news gathering practices that have been used for decades.
In terms of its attack on WikiLeaks, has tried to construct a theory which, if permitted, will be the end of national security journalism. Not just in the United States, but also about the United States. That claim is that journalists can't solicit information from sources. And to solicit information is to be involved in a conspiracy.
An accomplice to the conspiracy.
Yeah, and the United States, in terms of the charge types that it's trying to charge me with. Those include conspiracy and conspiracy to commit espionage. This is rubbish. We cannot tolerate this at the political level or the media level.
And for an hour, just to get a good first impression. Then we had a physical examination for an hour by our forensic expert, and then we had a 2-hour psychiatric examination. And all the three of us had the same impression, and well, I had certainly an impression, and the medical doctors had a diagnosis. We all came to the conclusion that he showed all the symptoms that are typical for a person that has been exposed to psychological torture over an extended period of time.
Well, Julian has been charged under the Espionage Act, the first time in the history of the United States, for receiving and publishing classified US information. That includes the collateral murder publication, the Iraq Rules of Engagement, which demonstrates war crimes in Iraq. It includes the Iraq and Afghan war logs, which demonstrated that the United States government was not sharing the truth about what was actually happening in those conflicts, including the killing of more than 15,000 civilians in the context of the Iraq War. He's also being prosecuted in relation to the State Department cables and the publication of those cables, which revealed human rights abuse and corruption the world over. These are incredibly important publications for which he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, the Sydney Peace Prize, won the Walkley Award for Most Outstanding Contribution to Journalism, and he faces 175 years in prison for doing his job as a journalist and as a publisher. That's why this case is so dangerous. And as you'll be hearing, the evidence that will be heard over the next 4 weeks is from journalists, from NGOs such as Reprieve, is what we heard from yesterday, talking about the importance of these leaks, how they've been used in terms of political movements, in terms of human rights litigation, in terms of holding governments to account for their wrongdoing. And more evidence also about the prison conditions that Julian will face if he is in fact returned to the United States to face prosecution. There's certainly been a change in approach from President Trump from prior to being elected and now in his role as president. What we saw was a change in position from the Trump administration. We now know that there was no indictment under the Obama administration. Of course, that whole process was secret because of the grand jury process, but the indictment was not issued until well into the Trump administration. And we had indications that the Trump administration was going to take a different approach when Mike Pompeo, as head of the CIA, declared that WikiLeaks is a hostile non-state intelligence agency and that they would be working to take WikiLeaks down and that Julian ought not benefit from First Amendment protections. Followed very quickly by statements by the Attorney General Jeff Sessions saying it was a priority to prosecute WikiLeaks. And now we've seen the outcome of that. We see an indictment where Julian faces 175 years in prison. This is part of, we say, the Trump administration's attack on journalism and war on whistleblowers and journalism. And it is a precedent that will be used against journalists, not just in the United States, but journalists around the world. Because the most dangerous thing about this, and a position that the United States Attorney has made clear in his evidence before this court, is that not only is the US government seeking to exercise jurisdiction over journalists and publishers outside of the United States for publishing information about the United States, they are also saying that they will exercise that jurisdiction, but at the same time, foreign publishers and journalists will not benefit and should not benefit from First Amendment protections. And that should be very concerning for journalists everywhere around the world. So we will be seeing over the next 4 weeks evidence from a number of experts on the free speech implications of this indictment. Daniel Ellsberg will also be giving evidence about his own experience as the leaker of the Pentagon Papers. We'll be hearing evidence from expert witnesses about the nature of the grand jury process, the nature of the US prosecution process, and the prison conditions inside prison. Historically, I think the position of the US press has been disappointing. We've been saying since 2010 that this was a risk and that if this precedent would be sought as against WikiLeaks, it could be used against the New York Times and other media organizations and journalists. But since this indictment was issued by the Trump administration, we've seen unanimous responses from the Washington Post, from the New York Times, from news organizations and free speech NGOs the world over, that this is a dangerous precedent for journalism and for freedom of the press, and that Julian ought to be released immediately. We've had a resolution from the Council of Europe calling on the UK to release Julian because of the danger of this precedent for press freedom. So I think that it is true to say that there is, I think, a chorus of mainstream media organisations, NGOs, and indeed some governments that say that this case is dangerous and it ought to be shut down. Well, as I explained, we haven't been able to visit him in prison since the pandemic broke out. All social and legal visits were cancelled, which means he's been even more isolated than he was before in this high security prison. Because of his long-term having been effectively imprisoned long term, he's 7.5 years inside the embassy and now inside the prison. He has a number of respiratory issues along with other health concerns which make him particularly susceptible to COVID. It has been difficult to even have video conferencing with him because of his doctor's advice that he shouldn't be moving within the prison because of the risk of contracting COVID. And there have in fact been a number of deaths, COVID deaths inside the British prisons since the outbreak of the pandemic. So we've been very concerned about his health from a pandemic perspective, but also seeing a decline in his health as a result of this long-term imprisonment. And it's very unusual. This is a publisher who is being held on remand in a high-security prison because of an indictment and an extradition request from the Trump administration. It is having a serious impact on his health, and we will be hearing further evidence, psychiatric evidence, about the impact this has had on Julian and what will happen to him and the doctor's concerns for him if he is returned to prison in the United States.
Is there any discussion between your team, Julian Assange's legal team, and the Trump administration over a pardon?
That will be the subject of evidence in these proceedings, so you'll have to wait to see what happens in court.